I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, we'll have Steve and Elena play the national anthem. I think we can just... We'll continue to hold the flag. Sometimes you have to ad-lib, don't you? Bravo, Steve.
Good job.
No fringe. Do you notice that? Thanks, Steve, for doing that, and Adam. Right now, it's my great privilege to introduce Joe Balyeat. He's the Montana State Director for Americans for Prosperity here in Montana. He's a former Montana senator serving 8 years. He also served in the House of Representatives for 2 terms. He's a former chairman of the House Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Committee. He's been on many, many committees. He's totally an amazing human being. And he's also a certified public accountant. He's a graduate of UM. Yay, cats. And he's here to educate us, and I know when you walk away from this meeting, you're going to be knowing more knowledge and having more insight into economics than you did when you walked in. Thank you so much.
We're going to see if this works with the microphone laying down. If it's not loud enough, let me know. And I'll try holding it up, but I can't think unless I'm moving my hands while I talk, so we're going to try it this way. I want to pass around before we get started our petition to stop wasteful spending by the federal government. And of course this is very timely. If you've been watching the news, you know that they just passed a stopgap measure. They haven't passed a real budget in 4 or 5 years, and they passed a stopgap measure to continue spending money like drunken sailors that takes us into January. So between now and January, we have to do some significant work, folks, to try to get the federal government to think twice before they spend our children and our grandchildren's inheritance and their future. I want to give you a few facts. Again, Gloria mentioned I'm a certified public accountant. You know, they talk about the national debt being $17.3 trillion right now, and that sounds like a lot of money. But the truth of the matter is that $17.3 trillion does not include major unfunded liabilities of the federal government, like things like Social Security and Medicare, and even the promises they've made to pay government pensions for government workers. And if you added in all those unfunded liabilities, the true national debt is not $17.3 trillion, it's $142 trillion. If if someone in the private sector did their balance sheet and left off those types of unfunded liabilities, their accountants would be in jail right now alongside the Enron accountants, okay? That $142 trillion, if you divide it out by every single taxpayer in the United States, it works out to be $1.25 million for every single taxpayer in the United States. So we simply have got to turn our federal budget around, and we've got to start now. So if you have not, I know some of you have already signed on, but if you have not signed on to our petition yet, I urge you to do so. I'm going to pass it around while I'm giving the economic freedom presentation. And please put your address and your email address in particular on there, and we'll keep in touch with you with, on this issue with your email address, okay? So now I'm going to get into the presentation on prosperity and economic freedom, and you're going to see the connection, because economic freedom is based on 5 different component parts. And one of those components, in other words 20%, is the size of government and government spending. Okay, so these issues are related. So with that, I'm going to get started. The day after last November's election, former Reagan campaign strategist Ed Rollins stared into the camera on Fox News, and he said very bluntly, he said, if conservatives want to remain relevant in American politics, they must engage in a massive re-education campaign to educate the average American voter about the basics of how economics works, how the free enterprise system creates more and better jobs, end quote. Now, I couldn't have agreed with him more. In fact, I passed out for your reading pleasure one of my op-eds that was published in most of Montana's major newspapers. You'll see that the one on one side is called Trick or Treat, the 142 trillion pound monster is back. But on the flip side, there's one called The Failing Big Government Agenda. And in that piece, you're going to see that I made a very similar statement a year ago about the failure of Mitt Romney to bridge the gap, to effectively explain to the average voter why lower taxes, limited government, and free enterprise are more important to the working man than they are to the wealthy. So what you are about to see is a PowerPoint presentation on economic freedom that I helped develop. It was compiled at our National Americans for Prosperity Foundation headquarters. And I believe if you get this message under your skin, you'll be able to effectively communicate to your friends, family, and neighbors why we need to elect leaders at all levels of government who support economic freedom. And you'll also be able to explain what 5 specific things to look for in any candidate for any office. Again, starting at the local level. And by the way, this is about a 45-minute presentation. When I'm done, we're going to hear from Adam Hertz, who is on the City Commission here in Missoula, and he's going to talk for just a few, 3-4 minutes about how these issues are impacted on the local level of government. But again, after you've seen this presentation, you'll be able to explain to your friends and neighbors what 5 things to look for in any candidate, whether they're running for federal office, state office, or local office. And also based on those 5 principles of economic freedom, you'll be able to talk with your elected officials and explain to them why certain pieces of legislation are either good or bad. And believe me, as a former state senator, don't assume that just because someone got elected to office that they understand the, excuse me, the principles of free market economics. They don't understand these 5 principles, most of them. They just do this and stick their finger in the air and see which way the political wind is blowing before they vote. So you'll be doing them a major favor if you talk to them based on these 5 principles. I'm going to leave room for a question and answer at the end, and Adam will join me for that. But if you have a question during the presentation that can't wait till the end, if it's going to impede your ability to understand the rest of the presentation, then go ahead and raise your hand, and I'll try to answer your question quickly and then move on. But at the end, we will have question and answer. So, why does economic freedom matter? Promoting economic freedom is a central part of our mission at Americans for Prosperity. But why is that important? I want to give you a simple case study that highlights this point very explicitly. This is a real-world case study. Your nation has suffered a brutal occupation which was followed by a devastating civil war that divided your country into two separate nations. Your people and your land have been ravaged, and you're now beginning the process of nation rebuilding from scratch. And you have two options to redevelop your country. You either have socialist central planning or you have free enterprise. You pick one option and your neighbor picks the other. Again, your nation has split into two. You pick one option, your neighbor picks the other. You protect property rights and allow free trade, and you encourage entrepreneurship. Your neighbor uses Marxist communist ideology to control nearly every aspect of their economy in order to produce what they believe will be an ideal society. Nearly 60 years have passed since your nation divided. And now, let's take a look at the comparison between the two nations. In your nation, you live 14.7 years longer on average than your neighbor. In your nation, you make 14.7 times more income on average than your neighbor. That's 1,470% more. In your nation, you spend 1,467 times more on health care. In your nation, you use 10 times more electricity per person and have 10 times more electricity available per person. In your nation, your chance of dying in infancy is 12 times lower than in your neighbor's nation, when in fact you're very common people once we're just one nation. So, where do you live? Does anyone want to take a stab at it, at what nations I'm talking about here?
Germany.
Anybody else? Someone said Germany, someone said Finland. What?
Korea?
Korea. You got it, sir. South Korea. These two nations, South and North Korea, started out roughly the same culture and similar resources. If anything, the neighbors to the north had the initial advantage. They had better industrial infrastructure and generous assistance from their Soviet friends. The South was made up primarily of poor subsistence farmers. And then 60 years later, this is what happens. You know, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. Even a nighttime picture is worth 1,000 words. This is a nighttime image from satellite of the light grid in the two countries of North Korea and South Korea. Wow. This is South Korea here, and this is North Korea. And you can see that the only point of light in the entire nation of North Korea is in the government's grand capital of Pyongyang. And that's, of course, what socialism does. It breeds a privileged ruling class while the rest of the nation lives in darkness. And, of course, that's just the opposite of as advertised. Socialism is advertised to spread the wealth to the working class. And, in fact, this one photo reveals that it's exactly the opposite.
What's the country to the north?
China. Okay, so this graph highlights the divergence in incomes between North and South Korea since the 1970s. And in this roughly 30-year graph, you can see that in North Korea, the average income has actually dropped roughly in half over what it was 30 years ago. And in South Korea, you can see the massive increases in average income as the years have gone on. When I look at this chart, I can't help but think of a quote by Winston Churchill. He said, "Capitalism may well be the unequal distribution of wealth, but socialism is certainly the equal distribution of poverty." North Koreans are all equal. They're equally destitute and desperate. They make less now than they did 45 years ago. South Koreans have a capitalist society with inequality, but even the very poorest are substantially better off than the socialist North. That's the key point, folks. Even the very poorest in free enterprise South Korea are better off than the socialist North. So this graph again highlights that divergence, and the quote I gave you from Winston Churchill, I'm told, is a paraphrase, and that this is what Winston Churchill actually said. Now, I swear I heard him say it the other way, but they're telling me this is the exact quote. The inherent vice of capitalism is the unequal sharing of blessings. The inherent virtue of socialism is the equal sharing of miseries. Let's listen to one of America's greatest presidents explain the connection between freedom and prosperity.
Prosperity can come about only when the farmer and businessman enjoy economic freedom. It is time to reawaken this industrial giant, to get government back within its means, and to lighten our punitive tax burden. Government is the problem. Together, we began the task of controlling the size and activities of the government. Today, America has the strongest economic growth, one of the lowest inflation rates, the fastest rate of job creation. We're enjoying the highest level of business investment in history. America is on the move again and expanding toward new eras of opportunity for everyone. There stands before the entire world one great and inescapable conclusion. Freedom leads to prosperity. Freedom is the victor.
Freedom leads to prosperity. Freedom is the victor. You know, we've been mired in this current U.S. recession for 5 years now, with the current administration claiming that nobody could have fixed it in one presidential term because it was, quote, the worst economy since the Great Depression, end quote. Those of you who know your history know that's baloney. Those of you like Fred Carl, who has lived that history, we were joking earlier that he was in the legislature around the time of the Civil War, you know that that's baloney.
And we're friends. And you're trying to tell us that Dennis Rodman we shouldn't listen to him about North Korea?
Unfortunately, I'm afraid so. You know that's baloney, this thing about the worst economy since the Great Depression. Ronald Reagan inherited a huge economic mess. Let me give you some of the figures. Double-digit inflation, double-digit unemployment, interest rates at more than 20%. How many of you remember that? Interest rates of 21, 22%. Ronald Reagan fixed it using free market principles of lower taxes, less regulation, and encouraging entrepreneurship in 2.5 years. Free enterprise works, and it would work to fix today's mess if our leadership got out of the way and simply let it work. In today's political climate, listening to Reagan is like a breath of fresh country air in a polluted inner city. He was called the great communicator for a reason. He could tear the heart out of his socialist opponents' arguments with such humor and wit that even his opponents would be laughing. Yeah. I'll give you one example. On their very first visit, Reagan told Gorbachev a little Russian story. He said a man went to the Moscow market and stood for hours in the bread line. When he finally got to the front of the line, the bread was all gone. In hungered frustration, the man started ranting. What kind of a system is this? We stand in these long lines just for a crust of bread, while in America they have bread, cake, fruit, and everything you could ever want. What's wrong with this country? Can't we see that communism is broken and doesn't work? Then a Russian policeman grabbed the man, saying, "Hey, you can't say those things about communism. Now shut up and go home." So the man went home to his wife and he said, "Honey, things are even more hopeless in this country than I thought. Not only is Russia out of bread, but now our police are out of bullets too." So with one friendly little private joke, Reagan had laid out the rotting, stinking corpse of communism for its own rulers' eyes. First, the economic oppression, the equal distribution of poverty. But secondly, that one little story also laid out the even sadder intellectual oppression, that, as Reagan put it, the free marketplace of ideas also stopped at the Iron Curtain. And finally, that one short little story also demonstrated the stark contrast with America, that our system was so far superior that we could provide both guns and butter, while theirs could provide neither bullets nor bread. That it was hopeless for Gorbachev to think that he could keep up with us either militarily or economically. So freedom works, folks, and there's no other system that can even compete. This is universally true across time and space. Historically and geographically, freedom works. Why does it work better than command and control socialist government? Because the first rule of economics is incentives matter. If people have an incentive to work hard, to build a nest egg and a castle for themselves and for their children, they will work hard. And collectively, they will produce wealth and be a productive nation. But if it doesn't matter how hard you work, if they all get an equal share of goods from a command and control socialist system, then there is no incentive to work hard, no incentive to be productive, and your nation will very soon find that you all are socialist equals, just like the North Koreans, with an equal share of poverty. So let's examine this academically to see how economic freedom works. There are, again, 5 components of a free economy. And Robert Lawson of Auburn University and James Gwartney of Florida State University have defined economic freedom into 5 different categories. They've gathered data from 141 different nations around the world, and then they've clustered these data into 5 major groups which they believe help to create economic freedom. The first of these is the size of government. Measures like top marginal tax rates and the percentage of gross domestic product that the government consumes. You'll note in that article that I wrote recently that was in the Missoulian that it talks about the fact that currently the U.S. deficit compared to our gross domestic product, the U.S. deficit is 140th, that ratio is 140th worst out of 144 nations. 5th worst in the entire world. Okay, size of government is one of the components. The second is regulation, things like labor regulations, price controls, interest rate controls, and other measures of government regulation of private sector activity. The third is sound money, things like inflation rate and other measures of monetary volatility. The fourth is free trade. Can citizens trade freely with international partners? And this also examines things like the amount of trade taxes and tariff rates. The fourth is the rule of law. 5th, I'm sorry. I'm a CPA, but I can't count. The 5th is the rule of law. Are the courts impartial? Are contracts enforced? Are property rights protected? And of course, this is the very basis of a free economy. A free economy hinges on the protection of private property. Without property rights, we couldn't freely exchange goods or services, and quite frankly, we'd have no incentive to work hard and build up a nest egg if the majority can just take away our nest egg by majority mob rule. A man named James Boulevard once made the statement, he said, democracy must be something more than 2 wolves and a sheep voting on what to have for dinner. So that's why you need the rule of law. So all these data in these 5 different categories of a free economy, all these data are publicly available. And the Fraser Institute does this collection of all this data, and they rank all 140 plus nations based on these 5 factors. And they call it the Economic Freedom Index. They also provide comparative data on the 50 states, and I will talk briefly about comparisons between the 50 states when we're all done. So they call it the Fraser Index or the Economic Freedom Index, and you can look it up on the internet and read more about it yourself. But once they rank all the nations from first most free nation to 144 or 141st least free nation economically, then we compile this graph. And on this axis, you see the average income per person in any given nation, okay? And on this axis, you see the nations ranked from left to right, from the least free to the most free nations. And the chart is, quite frankly, it's striking to see the absolute correlation that the nations that have the most economic freedom have far and away the highest income on average per person, whereas the nations that are the least free, that are command and control economies, have far and away the least income on average to the poorest nations in the world. And again, and I want you to soak in this graph a little bit, I again can't help but think of Churchill, that capitalism may well be the unequal distribution of wealth, but socialism is certainly the equal distribution of poverty. A few months ago, I had the opportunity to attend Professor Lawson's seminar in Washington, D.C., and I pointed out to him that not only is there a correlation here between average income and economic freedom, but that the correlation is an exponential curve, that it's steeper, the higher you go, the steeper the curve gets, and towards the bottom end, it's not a very steep curve. That's called an exponential curve. And I asked him if he agreed with my explanation of the practical implications of that. And that explanation is that at the upper end, even slight increases in economic freedom lead to substantial increases in average income. And conversely, even small backward movements away from economic freedom can result in rapid reductions in a nation's average income. And he said that he agreed fully with my explanation of the practical implications. That it's a very slippery slope, folks, at the upper end, that as we move away from economic freedom, we can, and quite frankly, I'll give you some data later on that shows that we are rapidly deteriorating our own average income in this nation. This bar chart here is the same data, but it's done in a bar chart as opposed to the curve graph. And in this chart, the nations of the world are broken into 4 different quartiles. This is the 25% of the nations that are the most free. This is the 25% of the nations that are least free in the world. And again, you can see the dramatic comparison that as you have more economic freedom, you certainly have more average income and wealth in your nation. And in fact, you can also see that it is exponential in nature. That when you drop from the top 25% of nations with economic freedom just down to the second quartile, the second 25%, that the average income drops by more than half. And so it's a very dramatic relationship, and it's a very slippery slope that as nations move away from economic freedom, they see dramatic losses in prosperity as a result, whereas if they move towards economic freedom at the upper end, they see dramatic increases in prosperity. So based on these charts and my explanation of them, I think we can all see that countries with the most economic freedom enjoy a wealthier lifestyle. But let me point out some additional things. Not only do they enjoy a wealthier lifestyle, I'm having an awkward Marco Rubio moment here.
Need water?
Not only do they enjoy a wealthier lifestyle, but they lead healthier, happier lives as well. They have better infant mortality. And again, this is comparing the 25% of nations that are the most free with the 25% of nations that are the least free. And you can see that the infant mortality rate is almost 12 times as high in nations that are not economically free. They have greater life expectancies. You can see that in nations that are the most free, they live roughly 1/3 longer lifespans. they lead more satisfied lives, and they've actually done studies where people rank their self-satisfaction on a scale of 1 to 10, and that people that live in nations that are economically free are far more happier with their lives. And in addition, and I'm going to talk more about this, nations that are most economically free have far better environmental quality, that based on an objective scale, those nations are far better in terms of how they protected their environment. So after looking at all these data, I will give you something that I know is paraphrasing Churchill, but this I'll call it my own quote. And this quote is, "Capitalism may well result in the unequal distribution of happiness, but socialism certainly results in the equal distribution of misery." And this chart, by the way, shows that in nations that are most economically free, they even have far higher literacy rates in those nations as well. I want to talk a little bit about the environment, because there's this false notion out there, and again, I graduated from U of M. I know this community, and I know that there's an element that basically has put forth this false notion from the left that economic progress is antithetical to environmental protection, and as the economy grows, that you're somehow damaging or hurting the environment. And yet all the evidence, and there are many studies around the world that have compared this, all the evidence shows just exactly the opposite, that those nations that enjoy the most robust economies, that those nations have the cleanest environments and have the most safeguards on their natural resources and on their environment. Robust economies are what pays for a clean environment. But I want to show it to you just with a picture again. And again, a picture's worth 1,000 words. You already saw the nighttime picture of North Korea and South Korea. This is the daytime Google image of North Korea and South Korea. And I want you to notice the striking difference in that North Korea is almost, and I apologize, we don't have bigger screen and I can give you a bigger picture of this and better resolution. But North Korea is almost totally deforested, while South Korea is still vibrant and lush and green. And if you look at that massive deforestation, you need to be aware that it's causing enormous erosion problems. When private companies remove timber, they have a huge incentive to reinvest and reseed. Because without more trees, there are no future profits. Without the incentives that private property provides, natural resources are often underused or overused and fall victim to what is called the tragedy of the commons. Environmental quality is a luxury good. The richer we are, the more we demand of it. Paying for a clean environment, as I've said, is only possible if you have a robust economy. And that's why the U.S. economy is far less polluting and far more advanced in environmental safeguards than less prosperous industrial economies in Russia and China. Poor, less free nations must consider basic needs before environmental quality because, quite frankly, surviving is more important than having a clean backyard. For instance, the lack of prosperity in less free countries gives those people in those countries little alternative but to cook with biomass fuels like wood, grass, and quite frankly, the most common is cooking with animal dung. And so this creates a massive problem with indoor pollution in developing nations. And believe it or not, that indoor pollution problem kills between 1.5 and 2 million people each year because of that indoor pollution. Countries like North Korea can't afford environmental safeguards, whereas in South Korea, private landowners have an incentive to replant seedlings and basically think long-term because of the incentives of private property. Secure property rights make us citizens better stewards of our resources. Just want to show you one more chart getting back to the economics of the thing. I pointed out that it was an exponential curve, that at the upper end of the curve it was steeper. And this just takes the bottom 10% of the nations that are the least economically free in the world and breaks it down, that bottom 10%, into 4 different quartiles. And this shows you that even at the bottom 10%, the poorest of the poor nations, that even there, it is an exponential curve, that as nations move towards economic freedom, they see rapid increases in average income in those nations. Okay, so now I've explained the 5 different components of economic freedom, and I want to get into where do we stand in the United States. And quite frankly, this is where it gets a little a little more depressing. And in fact, if we were meeting in another setting, I would say that now would be a good time to take a drink. Okay? But I just want to go through some of the numbers, and we're going to start back in 2000, and I'm going to walk you through 2000, 2008, 2011, 2012 to give you some sorts of comparisons. Back in 2000, the United States ranked 3rd in the world in economic freedom, behind Hong Kong and Singapore. Now, I'll tell you that during the Reagan era, the United States consistently ranked number 2 in the world. Subsequent to Reagan, we dropped to number 3, and we consistently ranked about number 3 through the beginning of this millennium. Unfortunately, since then, there have been some changes. In 2008, the United States dropped down to number 6 from number 3. And in 2011, this is what happened. We dropped all the way down to number 10 in the world in economic freedom. So, again, when I attended Robert Lawson's lecture in D.C., he was just about to come out with his new results for 2012. And there was a lot of speculation about what those would show because of the rapid changes that were taking place at the federal level in the United States. And when he came out with his rankings, this is what it showed. In 2011, the United States dropped all the way down to number 18. We dropped out of the top 10 all the way down to number 18. This is so in a matter of 1 decade, we went from number 3 in the world all the way down to number 18. Now, I got to tell you that they just recently recalibrated the data, because they always go back and correct it for any errors and stuff. And it turns out that in 2011 we were really 16th, not 18th. But in 2012 we dropped to 17th. So we're still sliding, but it's 17th right now and not 18th. Okay? So I want to break it down a little bit and get into the 5 different components of economic freedom and show you where the United States is slipping. In 2000, we were 34th in the world in size of government. So we, even way back then, we were not near the top of the heap. We have always had relatively a larger size government compared to our gross domestic product, and that's been one of the 5 elements that has dragged us down. But we made up for it because we were 9th in the world in property rights. We protected private property rights, and this also includes the rule of law, by the way. And we were 2nd in the world in sound money. Free trade, we were not quite as good, but we made up for it because we were 2nd in the world in regulation. We had limited regulation of our private sector economy. So here's what happened by 2011. We slipped all the way down to 54th in the world in size of government. And again, I talked about the government spending. That's what's causing it. In property rights, we had a major slide from 9th down to 26th. Sound money, we slid. Free trade, we slid. And in regulation, we had a massive drop from 2nd in the world down to 20th in the world in the amount of regulation of our private sector economy. Okay, so what's going on here? I'll argue that it's bad governmental policies, bad laws, too much spending, too much regulation. But I'll also argue that our global competitors are leapfrogging us. While the rest of the world is moving towards economic freedom, we, the nation that were the prime example of economic freedom and had the greatest economic engine in history, at this very moment when they're moving towards it, we're moving away from it. Okay? Now I want you to note this was 2000. I'm sorry, I'm going to go back up here for a second. This was 2000, and we slid all the way to 20th in regulatory intrusion into the private sector. And then in 2012, you'll note we slid even further in size of government, even further in property rights, free trade, even further loss. You'll note that in regulation, we were 20th and now we're 17th, okay? That doesn't mean that we repealed some regulation. Again, these are comparative rankings with the rest of the world. The fact that we moved from 20th to 17th, all that means is that there were 3 other nations in the world that passed even more regulations during that 1 year than we did. And so we leapfrogged back over them. And the reason I bring that up is I want to point out to you that our slide away from economic freedom might even be more dramatic if we were comparing it to a secure standard, a fixed standard. But we're comparing it to what is happening in the rest of the world. And even comparing to what is happening in the rest of the world, we are falling rapidly away from economic freedom. Okay? Okay, so the authors of the Fraser Index admit that it's difficult to point to the specific causal factors of our decline. They offer a few possibilities such as abuse of eminent domain, the government bailouts, and restrictions brought about by the war on terror. So they offer some possibilities. But whatever the particular drivers are that are responsible, it's clear that our dramatic descent was triggered by a combination of our own misguided public policies and the ability of our foreign competitors to adapt to a globally competitive world and move towards economic freedom. So in other words, as the rest of the world is doing the right thing, at least parts of the rest of the world are doing the right thing, moving towards it, we are abandoning the very thing that made our country great. Let me give you some of the results during that same period of time. During the same period of time when we slipped from 6th to 17th in economic freedom, that would be from 2008 to 2012. Same period of time, we've seen median household income in America also drop by 8.1% in those last 4 years. Many of us grew up thinking that income always went up, didn't we? That income always went up. During that 4 years from 2008 to 2012, income not only didn't go up, it dropped 8.1%. That's 4,400 less income for every single household in America. During that same 4-year period, as we slid from 6th to 17th in economic freedom, we've seen a 21% increase in the number of Americans living in poverty and a 70% increase in the number of people on food stamps. In that same 4-year period, 2008 to 2012, and listen to this statistic, we've seen the median net worth of American families plunge 39%. I'm going to repeat that. The accumulated nest egg of every family in America, on average, dropped almost 40% during that 4-year time period when we moved away from economic freedom in the United States. Again, it's a very slippery slope. Having another Marco Rubio moment. I need to explain that I was up in Alaska this summer and had a freak fishing accident. I was fishing for salmon, and I had killed a lot of salmon, so it was probably just bad salmon karma. But my last day out fishing, I had a brand new stretchy fly line and hooked into a big salmon. Right as I set the hook came loose, and the lead weight, you use a big lead weight even when you're fly fishing. Lead weight came back, and I was looking directly into the sun because the sun never sets up there in the summertime. And I was drilled in my good eye, my left eye, with a lead weight and was blind for quite a while, and I'm still fighting it. So I want to talk here, if I can find my cursor, I want to talk about some of the things we've done wrong, just quickly, and then we're going to talk quickly about the states, comparing the states, and we're going to have Adam come up and talk, and then we're going to take question and answers. So if I want each of you to think of some good questions to ask during the question and answer. The Fraser Institute's report is not alone in tracing the American decline in international economic competitiveness. The Heritage Foundation also has an annual index of economic freedom, and it shows a similar decline in the past decade. And in addition, there's a new report from the Independent World Economic Forum that showed the United States slipping from its #1 position in global competitiveness in 2008 all the way down to #7. And that particular report, by the way, also noted that we dropped 26 spots from 50th down to 76th in government regulatory burden. And it also ranked, as I pointed out, the U.S. deficit to GDP ratio as 140th out of 144 nations in the entire world. I mean, you think about all the nations that are characterized as having no fiscal responsibility. There are only 4 nations that are worse than us in the entire world in terms of our current spending rate. Okay. So policies matter. We have out-of-control spending. We have regulations such as the new Health Care Affordable Care Act. I know I'm using that phrase very loosely. Financial reform, we have environmental regulations. I want to quickly get into some of the different things we've done. Okay? By the way, this ranking of us being 17th is before Dodd-Frank and Obamacare are even fully implemented. Once they're fully implemented, we will probably see another dramatic drop down the food chain with respect to international economic competitiveness. Want to look at each of those 5 components and give you some ammunition so that you can explain it to others. This is spending, which is a good proxy for size of government, one of the 5 components. This is over from 1970 to 2010, a 40-year period. And you can see that the median household income went up by 24% during that 40-year period. Meanwhile, government spending went up not 24%, but 287.5%. Again, I mentioned the total national debt is estimated at $17 trillion. That doesn't include the $125 trillion of unfunded liabilities. But that $17 trillion, the part they admit to, is rising fast. Okay? In just 12 years, the direct U.S. debt has seen an increase of over 275%. In the last 3 years alone, the debt has risen by over $5 trillion, and this is in addition to the $5 trillion that was added between 2000 and 2009. So it's not only increasing, but the rate of increase is growing dramatically. Let's look at regulations real quickly here, okay? And this is a good way to gauge the number of regulations. It's the number of pages in the Federal Register. And the Federal Register is a collection of all the rules issued by the federal government. And you can see the rapid rise in the number of pages in that regulatory Bible, we'll call it. And I guess, by the way, the Obama administration has approved 613 federal rules just during the first 33 months of his term, and that compares with substantially fewer than that during the entire 8 years of the Bush era. Not that Bush is a remarkable role model either. But what I want to do is I want to ask, I assume you see this dramatic jump in regulation between the 1960s and the 1970s. And I want to ask if any of you would take a guess at what caused that dramatic jump. Someone, Great Society? No, that was not it. Anybody else want to take a guess at it? It was something that happened. Who said that? EPA. You are right. The EPA. And again, as is so often the case, big government solutions tend to backfire. I mean, the EPA sounds great as a soundbite, but when you understand the implications of how it is dramatically hamstringing economic growth in America, and how economic growth is the very thing that ultimately leads to a cleaner environment, then you understand that, quite frankly, we're probably killing the goose that laid the golden egg in our economy, which will ultimately lead to less environmental protection. Okay? That's another way to look at federal regulations here. This is the number of significant federal regulations, which is defined as those costing more than $100 million. And it has gone up dramatically during the current administration, where they have approved 129 significant regulations in the first 4 years, compared with only 90 for Bush's entire 8-year tenure. So that's the significant regulations there. This is one more way to look at the regulation impact. This is the cost to the federal government to enforce all its regulations, and this is called the seen cost of regulation. And you can see that it costs the federal government, which has to be extracted by way of taxes, $55 billion per year to enforce government regulations. But this chart only reflects the cost to government to enforce those regulations. It says nothing about the cost of compliance by the private sector. And quite frankly, that cost of compliance by the private sector dwarfs the cost to government. Let me show you. There's 55 million here in this next chart, 55 billion. The next chart has been rescaled. This is the unseen cost of regulation, what it costs the private sector to comply with all those government regulations. And you can see the chart has been rescaled. The 55 billion from the previous page is now just this tiny blue line at the bottom. It costs the federal government 55 billion to enforce it. It costs the private sector $1.75 trillion to comply with all of those government regulations. When I was in the legislature, we had something that accompanied almost every financial bill before the legislature, and it was called the fiscal note. And as a CPA, I was the only CPA in the legislature, I would often complain that those fiscal notes only showed what it cost government if we passed this new law, and that they showed nothing about the cost to the private sector. And during several legislative sessions, I carried bills to revise fiscal notes to make them also give an estimate of how much it would cost government, how much it would cost the private sector to comply with this new law if we passed it. And finally, in my last session, I got a bill passed through the legislature that, at least for very large new bills that had more than a $10 million impact, that it would also have to include an estimate of how much it would cost the private sector to comply. And our so-called pro-business governor at the time vetoed that bill, even though I got it all the way through the legislature. So we still don't have any accountability there, but we're working on it. Okay, so now I want to just take 3-4 minutes and look at a comparison between the states. And there's an interesting thing when you look at the states. I apologize, I see that it's up too high. An interesting thing that you can do with the states is they're like an economic laboratory, because people can move pretty freely. There's high mobility from one state to another. That's not true at the international level. I mean, people can change countries, but it's very, very difficult. So it's not a good gauge of how economic policies affect people's lives. Whereas within the states, the interstate comparisons are a perfect laboratory to examine how economic policies affect people's lives. And economists call it voting with your feet. People in various states will move away from a state that is enacting bad economic policies and move towards states that are enacting good economic policies. They vote with their feet. And this compares here the 9 states that had the lowest income tax rates during the last decade with the 9 states that had the highest income tax rates in the last decade. And you can see that the 9 states with the highest income tax rates lost a net out-migration of more than 4 million people. Just decided to give up and move away from those states. And where did they move to? Roughly 3.25 million of them moved into states that had the lowest income tax rates. And by the way, those were all 0 income tax rate states. They had no income tax in those states. Okay, let's look at 3 examples of individual states. Okay, and one of those is going to be Montana. New York, its economic rank is 50th, worst in the entire country. Why is it ranking so poorly economically? The top marginal income tax rate is 50th, worst in the entire country. The top marginal corporate tax rate is 50th, worst in the entire country. The inheritance tax rate is 50th, worst in the entire country. They got good news on the property tax burden. They're only 43rd worst. They're dead last in all the others, okay? They also are dead last in the country in terms of their recent tax changes, where they're trying to, they think, fix a problem. They're going the wrong direction, okay? And economists who study this have provided studies and results of those studies that show that even in a state that has real high taxes, if they move their taxes down, even if it's still above average, that recent changes will have a dramatic effect in terms of raising the income level of the citizens and leading to economic growth. But in their case, they're doing it exactly wrong. They're dead last in the country, moving the wrong direction when they were bad already. The net result of all this brain power is they had an out-migration of more than 1 2/3 million people. So all the brainiacs wanted to solve their budget deficit by raising taxes, and all they really did was drive their most productive citizens out of their state. It's exactly what they did nothing to solve their budget problems. And where did those 1 2/3 million people that left New York go to?
Texas.
They went to Texas. Okay? Economic performance ranked their 2nd best in the entire country. Economic outlook ranked 16th best. Their top marginal income tax rate, 1st best in the entire country. They have no income tax. Their top marginal corporate tax rate is 7th best in the entire country. Their inheritance tax rate is 1st best. They have no inheritance tax. Their property tax burden is 37, so it's below average, but it's somewhat understandable since they have no income tax in that state, okay? And their recently enacted legislative tax changes, they're 12th best in the entire country. So they're looking at it and saying, it's working, let's do more of what's working, okay? So we're almost done, so we could, it has to be asked now, we could wait till the question and answer. Is it a real quick question?
Well, I'm just wondering, in these states that are the low income tax states, do they all have sales tax?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. But we can talk about sales tax versus income tax in the question and answer, okay? I'd be happy to talk about that briefly. Okay, so now I've given you the 2 extremes. Let's talk about Montana. The economic outlook rank is 36 out of the 50 states, so we're significantly below average. Our top marginal personal income tax rate is 31st, so it's slightly below average. It's 6.9%. And by the way, just so you know, before I got to the legislature, we had the worst income tax rate in the entire country by far. We were far higher. It was at 11%. We were far higher than New York or California. And in fact, not only was our income tax rate the highest in the nation by far, but our capital gains tax rate was at 11% as well. In fact, by the time you figured in the federal deductibility, our capital gains tax rate was even higher than our income tax rate. So we were really in bad shape. And when I got to the legislature, I pointed out that it was not a matter of mere coincidence that we had both the highest income tax rate in the whole country and the lowest average wages in the whole country. Because there are many studies that show that there is a direct connection, that states that have high income taxes have slow wage growth. And so we bounced along near dead last or dead last in the country for many, many years. And when I was in the legislature, I take pride in the fact that that was one of the most significant things I accomplished. Was I personally, made the amendments to it. We hijacked a Senate bill. I was in the House. I amended the bill to lower our income tax rate from 11% all the way down to 6.9%. Our income tax, our capital gains tax rate from 11% all the way down to 4.9%. And I predicted at the time that based on the economic studies that say that recent tax changes will result in dramatic effects on your state's economy, I predicted that we would see rapid wage growth in Montana in the quarters subsequent to making that tax change. And sure enough, in 3 of the next 4 quarters, Montana wage growth ranked in the top 10 in the entire nation in 3 out of those 4 quarters. So it works, but unfortunately we've slid back again due to other aspects of economic freedom in Montana. And that's what I want to talk about. But let me finish going through the data. Top marginal corporate income tax rate, we're 21st, so we're a little better than average. Inheritance tax, we're first, we rank high, and in other words, we rank well, and that's because, again, while I was in the legislature, we got rid of our inheritance tax. We no longer have one in Montana. Our property tax burden is 36, and that's going the wrong direction. We're sliding backwards compared to other states. But our recently enacted legislative tax changes, we rank 3rd best in the entire country. And again, this was based on 2011. I haven't got this updated for the 2013 session yet. Our legislature only meets every other year. 2011 was the last year that I was in the legislature because of term limits. And so I again take pride in the fact that at least we were moving the right direction. As a net result, our domestic migration into Montana was a plus 40,000 during that decade. So folks, there you have it. And by the way, the U.S. Small Business Friendliness Index shows that Montana was 32nd out of the 50 states in small business friendliness. I sometimes talk about the moral case for economic freedom, but I think I'm preaching to the choir in that regard. I think most of us understand that freedom is a great thing, whether you're talking about economic freedom or other types of individual freedom. And so I'm going to leave time for Adam to speak, and then I'm going to take your questions and answers, and Adam's going to help me. So with that, folks, I thank you for your attention. I want to introduce Adam Hertz, who is on the City Commission here in Missoula. He says there are 12, so he's one of the 12. Not one of the 12 apostles, one of the 12 commissioners. And I urge you to think of some questions. Adam, come on up.
Nice job. Well, thanks, Joe. Great presentation, and appreciate you having me this evening. Just trying to set that up there. I'm Adam Hertz. I'm represent Ward 2 on the City Council, which we're sitting in right now, so kind of west and northwest Missoula. I just wanted to thank Americans for Prosperity and Missoula Patriots for hosting this. So we're here this evening because we believe in economic freedom, and I think most of us know that the free market system is the single best path to prosperity and wealth creation and even income equality. And as Ronald Reagan put it, I know we're just preaching Ronald Reagan tonight, but the best social program is a job. And I think the evidence clearly shows that more economic freedom means more job, more GDP, higher wages, and less unemployment. So I remember filling out candidate questionnaires for the city council a couple of years ago. I actually got some flack for my answer. They said, what is the single greatest challenge facing the city of Missoula? And I said, economic freedom. And I got a lot of flack for that. People said, what about affordable housing? What about regulation? What about fixing our potholes? And my answer is, if we have more economic freedom, we have more chances for affordable housing. We have more chances for better paying jobs. We have a bigger tax base, so we can fill up the city coffers and fill the potholes.
Right.
So it leads to economic freedom, leads to job creation, lower unemployment, longer lifespans, all of the lists that Joe shared with us. And so we hear a lot these days about the 1% and the 99%. And I'd just like to offer a little bit of perspective on that. If you earn an income over $34,000 a year, you're one of the wealthiest 1% people on the globe. So it may not seem like that in the United States, but if you look globally, $34,000 a year, you're in the top 1%. Not hundreds of thousands a year, not millions a year, $34,000 a year puts you in the 1%. So evidence shows that even though that doesn't seem like a lot to us in America, I mean, that's less than a median income in the United States. And so it's because of our history of economic freedom and the free market system in the United States and the incredible idea that America has illustrated the importance of economic freedom. And so as our economic freedom continues to be under attack in Washington, D.C., and Helena, and the county courthouse, and at City Hall, I say that we can't just be defensive. Our answer can't always be, no, we don't want this, no, we don't want that. We have to fight bad ideas with good ideas. And so I think not only do we want to stop from losing our economic freedom, but we want to work aggressively to expand our economic freedom. And I'll just share one more point with you in regard to municipalities. A 2013 study from Florida Gulf Coast University ranked Missoula 160 in the Municipal Economic Freedom Index out of 384 cities. So they just took some of the larger cities in each state, and so even though it doesn't feel like it in Missoula, sometimes we're actually kind of right in the middle of that study. And the difference in per capita income in cities that ranked the most free to cities that were in the middle, where Missoula was about $600 per capita. So it doesn't seem like a lot, but if you take that in the context of a city like Missoula, within the city limits, we've got about 68,000 residents. That $600 per 68,000 residents is $41 million a year in total income that our residents are missing out on because of slipping economic freedom. And it's $41 million that would go to mortgage payments and rent payments and food and school and healthcare. And if you compare the lowest cities on that index, the least free to the most free, it's about a $2,000 difference. And so a city in the size of Missoula, that'd be somewhere in the range of 140 million plus. So I just wanted to share a little bit with you about that, and wanted to thank you for having me, and I'll turn it back to Joe for some questions.
Great, and I want Adam to stay up with me to answer some of your questions. Does anybody have any questions about the presentation, about what's happening in the state of Montana or at the national level? Yes.
I apologize if you answered this. I couldn't get your presentation. But could you define what you mean by economic freedom, like kind of on the ground, what that actually means?
Sure. Again, based on the work by the Fraser Institute and the work by James Courtney and Robert Lawson, they would break it down into those 5 different component parts. The size of government, and again, they don't want to compare apples and oranges. So when they measure the size of government, they measure things like federal spending as a ratio divided by your gross domestic product. So they can compare large nations with small nations. So the first component would be the size of government. The second would be the level of regulation. Third would be the rule of law. Are private property rights and contracts enforced? Do you get a fair break in court? That sort of thing. The fourth would be sound money, and the fifth would be free trade. And so, based on, and again, you can compare cities, you can compare states, and you can compare nations, because a lot of this data is, in fact, all of this data is publicly available. And it's an incredibly rigorous process that they go through compiling all this data on all 141 nations and all 50 states. And so it's an objective measure that they come up with based on those 5 component parts. It's an objective measure that they come up with, and then they just rank them from top to bottom based on that. Okay? Other questions? Yes, Gloria.
You said there were 4 other nations worse than the U.S. when it came to spending. Could you tell me who they are?
I apologize, I don't know the answer,
I'm sorry.
and I don't want to fake it.
I'm sorry to embarrass you.
Okay, yes, sir.
Well, I'm really wondering, we talk about the listing of the most economically free countries. You've got Hong Kong at apparently number 1. Now, Hong Kong is owned by Communist China. How can that be?
That's a very good point. And again, this data is going backwards. So as you know,
Repeat the question so
Yeah.
everybody hears.
okay, he's pointing out that Hong Kong is owned by Communist China, so how can it be ranked as the most economically free? Well, again, that was a relatively recent phenomenon, and we're going to have to see going forward if Communist China basically intrudes into the economics of Hong Kong, and that may change rapidly in the future. But it's a very good point that lead marker may change rapidly.
It's been 14 years.
Yeah.
16 years.
Yeah, but again, government moves slowly, and thank God sometimes that it moves slowly. Hopefully it'll move very slowly with respect to capturing Hong Kong into a command and control economy. And of course, you know, they put in a lot of safeguards where they promise not to force Hong Kong into that command and control economy. So hopefully that will continue in the future, but we will have to see. Did you have your hand raised, or you're just okay? Yes, you, sir.
Number 4, free trade. It seems like since we started this NAFTA free trade phenomenon going on, that our manufacturing jobs have gone overseas. Shouldn't that be more like free trade? It seems like our corporations have been allowed to take their manufacturing overseas, hold their profits overseas, and actually act like 2 different companies. The company over there sells their products to the holding company in the United States that can keep the profits overseas so they don't have to be taxed.
Yeah. Okay, I think you meant to say, shouldn't that be more like fair trade?
Fair trade.
You said free trade, but I knew what you meant. You know, that's an argument. It's almost like which came first, the chicken or the egg argument, okay? Because a lot of what is driving companies overseas is the first rule of economics. Incentives matter. And if you disincentivize business from staying in America by regulations, by high taxation, by not having a consistent rule of law, if you disincentivize businesses being here, then that first rule of economics is there's going to be a natural migration of businesses. Are just going to, they're either going to move over there, or new businesses are going to crop up over there that our businesses are not going to be able to compete with because of the fact that we have violated these principles. So I understand what you're saying about it should be fair trade, and are these corporations abusing the system? The corporations may well be abusing the system, but they're abusing the system because the system first abused them by enacting all these bad policies that have disincentivized them and made them not want to stay here and have the jobs here. So it's a chicken and egg answer, and I'm sorry about that, but that's the best I can do. Other questions? Yes, Fred.
A couple of things. Number 1, regarding Hong Kong, which was a British colony until, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago.
And a lot of people don't realize that a lot of those Chinese realized with China taking over that they were going to be in trouble. And if you go to Vancouver, Washington, they were allowed to move and get citizenship in Canada if they had $10 million. And so it slowed, and the economy there is still a leftover from the free trade and free economy they had under the British system. And another thing, as far as our companies moving overseas, part of that, Joe, I think you'd agree, is the heavy taxes here. They wanted to get away from taxes, and they could build the things cheaper. But I find a lot of companies now are starting to come back or starting to produce, made in America. Now, for me.
Is there a question in there somewhere?
Yeah, Joe, you gave I mean, that was excellent, in my opinion, of giving us all kinds of knowledge on what we should do. Now, with that knowledge,
Okay.
what should we do with the knowledge?
It's a very good question, and I tried to answer that a little bit at the beginning. There are a lot of different things you can do with this knowledge, folks. You can talk to your friends, your family. Your family's most important. Your children, your neighbors. Quite frankly, if any of you have connections with schools, I'd love to get into the schools and start making this presentation in either private schools or public schools. So if any of you have connections, please get me in touch with somebody to try to get this presented in some of the schools in the community. So you can influence your friends and neighbors with knowledge, okay? You can also use that knowledge to make decisions about who to vote for in elections based on how does these two candidates compare on these 5 component parts. But even after that, once they are elected, once they're already in office, you can approach them on various issues that come up, and based on these 5 different issues, tell them whether or not that's a good bill or a bad bill. Hey, in case you don't know it, Mr. Official, that's a bad bill because it's intruding into the rule of law and private property rights. Or that's a bad bill because it's increasing regulation in an area that is not necessary, or something along those lines. So you want to use this information to communicate with elected officials. You want to use this information to make decisions about who to elect. And you want to use this information to influence your friends, your neighbors, your family in particular, especially the next generation. Because they're the ones, the next generation is the ones who are going to be left with our mess and to pay for our mess, especially with respect to the size of government. We are leaving them with an enormous burden around their necks. And somehow we've got to get the message out that they're the ones that are going to be hurt by it if we continue to move away from economic freedom. We'll go with this gentleman and then you, sir.
I noticed on your graph, one of your graphs up there, that on federal spending, U.S. government spending,
Yes.
that there was the steepest part of your curve was actually during the Reagan presidency. And I also know, too, that during, starting in the 1980s, the average wage for American workers has essentially remained the same from then until today. Yes, that's the, so there's a very steep, actually there's a, during the recession it's steeper, but during the Reagan administration it was very steep. The one thing that you don't have up there is, and that's really relevant I think to economic discussion, is the productivity of American workers. And it's pretty much follows a pretty straight line ever since World War II. But yet, come 1980, that line, American workers are still being very productive, and wages have remained essentially flat. In fact, flatter than that median household income, which I suspect might be going up because of government payments. I don't know your graph very well, but I know wages themselves have been essentially flat. How do you comport that? That all started within the Reagan.
Yeah.
How does that? How do you comport that with economic freedom?
It's a good point. It's a good point. But, you know, again, just to remind you, Reagan had a democratically controlled Congress, okay?
Not at first.
Well, for the bulk of his administration, he did. And if you're looking at the chart, for the bulk of his administration, he did. And
Well,
quite frankly, he didn't have a free hand, even as the current administration no longer has a free hand. When they did have a free hand, you saw what they did, and the net result is Obamacare. I'm not here to defend everything that Reagan did. I quote him a couple times, and I think he was one of our best presidents. But when you have a Congress that basically wants to spend and spend and spend, it's difficult.
but I'll just say that on your rankings of freedom in the United States was number 2 not that long ago, right? Or 3, I guess. That certainly included this time period in the 1980s when
That's right.
the average American worker is not benefiting from the increase in productivity.
Yeah, and that's your second point, and let me get to that real quick. I would argue, you might not agree with it, but I would argue that the reason that the median household income didn't see that much benefit from the increase in productivity was because of the fact that we started sliding away from economic freedom, and a lot of that productivity was absorbed by the growth in the size of government.
During the Reagan presidency,
Yeah.
then is where that started.
I'm not going to argue with you.
I'm going to
Okay.
argue with him if I
Yeah.
get a chance.
Please go.
Well, what I'm going to say is during the Reagan administration, what caused the extra federal spending was that the revenue shot up. Like in a matter of a few years, the revenue, the amount of money coming into the Treasury increased like double.
And politicians will spend every last
And we
dime
had
they
a
get.
Democratic Congress that
And
spent
then-
$1.33 for every new dollar of federal income that came into the Treasury. So if
Yeah.
you have all this new money coming into the Treasury, you've got somebody over here willing to spend it, and they did. And the spending would not have gone up at the rate it did if they wouldn't have had all that new income.
As a former politician, I will fully agree with you there. As the first thing I learned when I was in the legislature after the first session was, doesn't matter which party they're in, politicians will spend every last dime they can wring out of the private sector. And I personally believe the only way you can rein in government is through refusing to raise taxes or lowering taxes to restrain it on the income side rather than on the spending side, because politicians do not have the political will to not spend every last dime that comes into the Treasury. Sir, you had I told you we'd take you next, and then we'll go over here.
Sounds like we're arguing here a little bit, but you said kick the can down the road to the next generation. I think we're going to collapse much before that. And our currency is, if it's not gone in the next 6 to 12, 18 months, I'll really be surprised. And that's going to rank us with the worst countries in the world.
We are on dangerous ground, and again, you might read the op-ed that I wrote, the 142 trillion pound monster. I won't deny that we're on dangerous ground. Go to you next, and then this lady here. No, I'm talking about the gentleman behind you. That's okay. We had one from you already, and we will get back to you too, but I want to get everybody with it.
First off, during that Reagan period, the amount of money spent on social programs was not as steep as it is now, because we had a little problem, and it was called the Russia, the People's, and the PRC, People's Republic of China. And Union Socialist Republic is no longer there.
So you're arguing that it was you're arguing that it was military spending and not necessarily increasing the welfare.
That had an influence. But now, I want to move forward on that. We talk about supporting local candidates. This is a national issue, is what's sucking us under. And when you look at the California, for 35 million people, there's a larger population than the remaining 10 western states. You add Oregon and Washington into that, and those 3 states have more social pressure on Congress than all the rest clear to the Mississippi River. We got one congressman out of 435. But we got 2 senators out of 100. And the 2 senators we have align with the Pacific Rim states, California, Oregon, and Washington, in terms of where they support these massive social increases. If we want to influence this thing, we have to get people in the Senate that will pay attention to what you told us tonight. That's the make or break point in our future. And I agree with that gentleman.
Okay.
I'm 74 years old, and if I live to be 84, I hope I don't see the demise of this republic, because I think it's a very real thing to happen.
Okay. You make some very valid points. I didn't hear a question in there, so so we're going to go on to the ladies' question. Yeah, we're going to go on to the ladies' question, and that's fine what you did, but let's try to keep the commentary to a minimum and get to a question. Go ahead, ma'am.
Commentary, quick technical question. Was this Fraser Index, did you say it was 140 countries?
141.
141,
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Go to you, sir. Yes.
Okay. I can't quite tell, when did the line start going down on that red line? What year? Because it's...
Right here?
No, yeah, at the very top, it started going down. It's going down now.
That's an arrow pointing.
Yeah, I think that's an arrow pointing. Yeah, that's not really going down.
That graph is going down.
Yeah.
That graph is going down.
Yeah. Sir, if you give me your email address afterwards, I'll check into that and see. But I think that's an arrow pointing to the top of the chart right there.
That's funny.
Okay.
Yeah, because down the bottom.
Any other questions? We'll go with you.
Yeah, concerning sound money, how do you, I would like you to discuss the impact that our quantitative easing and the amount of money we spent and the amount of money we're continuing to spend, $85 billion a month, how is that impacting sound money?
Yeah, well, again, if you recall the charts where we had the different components broken down, you saw that we were rapidly declining on the sound money portion of the index. I don't want to get into a long thing at this time of night on quantitative easing, but yeah, I think we're making some serious mistakes in that regard too. It's all adding up to
Can you
one.
relate it a little bit to the stock market, then? The quantitative easing, the impact it's having on the stock market? Just a little bit.
You want to take a shot at that? Yeah, I think I'll pass. Yeah. Yeah, well, okay, I'll respond to that in this way, sir. I have maintained for several years that the stock market is more influenced based on fears of inflation than it is based on underlying productivity of the companies. That prices in the Dow Jones and the other stock market indexes are fear factors, that people push their money into the stock market if they fear inflation. And that's why you often see the stock market go up during administrations that are free spenders, because people fear inflation and so they push their money into stocks. Okay? Fred's had his hand up here for a while, and then we'll go to you, sir.
One of the things that Joe said that we should pay attention, take this material, tell our friends so that they know, how to vote a little bit more intelligently. Not only nationally, and we know we're in big trouble there, but look at the state. Just to give you an idea, in the state, back when Tom Judge was the governor, the state had 7,500 state employees. We had a population in the state at that time about 875,000 people. Today we are around 1 million people, and see who has been running the state, and we have over 22,000 state employees. The federal government, during this time that everything has been going downhill, employment has been going downhill. In Washington, the employment has increased 10%.
That's not good.
So we have to watch, and quite frankly, if people pay attention, and I'm going to be very blunt when I say this, if people pay attention, I cannot see, if they know what's going on, how in this day and age they could vote for a Democrat.
I
Well,
agree.
listen, I'm going to cut it off here. I think this gentleman had one more. I'm going to let you have one. Do you have a question, sir?
Well, I was just going to make a comment on the fact the stock market keeps going up because of the excess printing quantitative easing, because that holds the interest rates down and people can't get anything out of their money saving, so they're willing to gamble.
Definitely
And
has
it's
a
just a big
connection.
slot machine.
Okay, we'll let you have one last word, and then we're going to wrap it
No, it's
up.
not a war.
Okay.
Out of the 14,000 additional employees, how many of those are the result of increased federal regulation?
Yeah. I don't know the answer. I know we're going in the wrong
That's a
direction.
good question.
Folks, I want to thank you for your attention tonight. Gloria,
I was gonna ask
Gloria.
Adam, he actually asked for information from the mayor at the hearing on Monday. Is he starting to give you the information that you requested on the water, purchase of the water corporation? You wanted to see specific statistics or something?
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk about financial information in regards to purchasing the water system.
Right.
And I've heard a few general numbers thrown about, but we, as a city council and as the public, haven't been given any specific numbers. So there's been closed door meetings with investment bankers and attorneys and financial advisors with the mayor. But he's not willing to release any financial information or the minutes of those meetings or anything else to the general public or to the city council members. And I haven't gotten that information, and I'm told I'm not going to get that information.
Thank you for being a stand-up guy for us.
Folks, thank you for your attention tonight. I think it's been a real good meeting, and I do want to let you know we got some articles in the back, several more op-eds that I've written over the last year. Feel free to take any of those with you. Also some books and other literature, and there's even a little bit of souvenirs back there. We also have a box for donations if any of you see fit to donate tonight to what we're doing. Yeah, Adam's got one more thing.
One quick thing, I understand this is Joe's birthday on Saturday, so Gloria wants to wish him a happy birthday.
We're all going to sing happy birthday, okay? I'm not on. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Joe. Happy birthday to you. And many more.
Thank you. Saturday, my birthday, is the first day of rifle hunting season, and I could not have a better birthday present than that. Thanks for coming.